Okay, so again, we'd like to welcome everyone. We're happy to have you join us for this fifth session of the series. This session is titled Faith-Centered Approaches to Fighting Sexual Violence. So I don't believe I've introduced myself yet, but my name is Shelby Phillips. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the Project and Communications Coordinator at Valor. And I'll be on today's session to provide you all some extra tech support. But at this time, I would like to pass the virtual mic over to your presenters for today and allow them to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Shelby, and thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Sarah Orton. I use she, her pronouns. I am on staff at Valor US. I'm a project coordinator. I work primarily on our rape prevention education project in California, but also on some of our advocacy and intervention projects as well. And I'm really excited to be here and be sharing with you all a little bit today from our experiences of working with survivors of faith, and also providing some information for folks who are part of faith communities about responding to, intervening in, and also preventing sexual violence in their faith communities. I'm really excited to be joined today by Malika from Seek Family Center, and I'm going to hand it over to her so she can introduce herself and tell you a little bit about her work, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks, Shelby, and thank you for everyone who's here today. We have to recognize this is still a difficult, unpredictable, anxiety-causing time, and you've chosen to be here on a Thursday morning, and so we really, or afternoon, wherever if you're calling in from elsewhere, but it's really nice to be here. It's important to be here because the work I have always done has involved working with different faith communities. And also working with those who have no allegiance to any faith community, but stand in solidarity with different groups. So I'm a writer, and I also am a teacher. I teach at UC Berkeley School of Law. So I'm a lawyer by training in a different life, perhaps. I have the privilege of serving as the acting executive director of the Seek Family Center, which is a small community-based nonprofit that was formed given the events, especially that followed the decade after the 9/11 attacks. So the Sikh community with the turbans, the beards, the brownness, all those intersecting vulnerabilities after 9/11 came under immense scrutiny, attack, hate crimes, discrimination. And as would be familiar to so many of you from communities of color and communities that have been discriminated against, those most vulnerable within those communities, their issues get pushed further and further into the shadows. So in our case, we were very concerned about issues of gender violence and gender justice not getting enough time and space and recognition. So a few of us came together in 2009 and started the Seek Family Center, and we provide intervention, prevention, and education services to the community. And it's really a pleasure to be here, because I think sometimes when people think about faith, there's a very narrow definition. And for the Sikh community, where there's no division between private and public expressions of faith, between secular and religious, like we've often been at this very interesting space where sometimes we're not at the interfaith or interreligious kind of round table. So I really want to thank Valor USA for asking us in, and I hope to have a great conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much for that, Malika. And I'm just so excited to be presenting alongside you today. We quickly, just some learning objectives, or you can think of them as our agenda for the day. What we're hoping to do today is spend some time just describing the impact of sexual violence on individuals and communities, particularly those with strong faith traditions or communities or backgrounds. We also want to identify some resources for you to support survivors who have experienced sexual violence. We'd also like to spend some time talking about some different action steps that we can take to really bolster the role of faith leaders and spiritual healers and anyone else under that umbrella in disrupting sexual violence and fostering whole community healing inside of their faith communities. And then we'll also just spend some time talking some strategy about building strong partnerships with your local sexual assault agencies, also called rape crisis centers, which we'll get into that in a little bit as well, and also just other social justice organizations that fall under that umbrella. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to start by launching a quick audience poll. We just like to know who is in the audience today. So you should see that poll appear on your screen right now. You should be able to select more than one in the options here, because we know that folks are often more than one thing, and we often have to choose between our identities or kind of how we're showing up in this work. So we have a faith-based organization or congregation. It looks like we have a couple folks from there. We have some rape crisis center folks from dual organizations, meaning serving both survivors of intimate or domestic violence, intimate partner or domestic violence, and sexual assault survivors. We have several folks who are identifying as survivors, several who are identifying themselves as members of the community, which of course we all are, folks who are friends or family members of survivors, or other, and we'll see if somebody typed in the chat. Let's see, Interfaith Education Nonprofit. Thank you, Lisa. We're so excited to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. I'll share the results, so you should be able to see that on your screen if you're curious. And we have one more poll that we are going to quickly launch. I have to stop sharing that poll. So the next thing that we'd like for you to share with us is how familiar you are with our work at Valor US, formerly known as CalCASA, or the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Maybe you're very familiar, maybe you come to our events all the time, maybe you're slightly familiar, maybe you've heard of us, but you don't know a whole lot about it. Maybe you're not familiar at all, or you're just totally clueless that we exist. You've never heard of our organization until now. So I will give folks who want to participate just a couple more seconds to participate in the poll before I end it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll and I'll share the results. So it looks about half and half, very familiar or slightly familiar to very familiar. And then we have a couple folks who are not familiar at all. So we're really glad to presumably be your first web conference with us. And then something else that we like to say before we get started is this content could impact you. We're talking about sexual violence. Sexual violence is not a safe subject. It could bring up feelings or triggers or emotions, even physiological responses. And we'll actually talk about that in a few minutes. So we just want to remind everyone before we get into it to please take care of yourself, step away if you need to. You can mute us for a little bit. You can always reach out for support. If you go to our website at valor.us and then click Get Help, it will pull up a whole list of all of your local sexual assault programs and crisis lines. And in addition to that, feel free to be on camera or off camera, eat or drink or whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So as Shelby mentioned, these web conferences are actually based on a guide that Valor US has been working on that will come out in the fall. And this document, this guide is called Collective Power, a Community Blueprint. And we've really been working on this guide through the lens of cultivating community relationships and really trying to underscore the importance of building whole community safety nets for survivors of sexual violence. When we say safety net, we're talking about how sexual violence can impact all areas of a survivor's life, and oftentimes many different services are areas of support and are needed for healing. So there's this like ripple effect that we see. And sometimes we can be really siloed in our work. But the issue with that is that trauma doesn't exist in silos, and trauma doesn't respect boundaries, and trauma often does not stay compartmentalized. And so, the onus is really on us, people in the community, people who are friends or family members of survivors, people who work in faith congregations or organizations. It's really up to us to build these relationships and collaborate and put together all of our expertise to support people who are the most vulnerable to experiencing sexual violence in our communities. And we're calling this guide a community blueprint, and it is aptly named Collective Power because we know that we're stronger together. So that will kind of be the theme of our work, as we're talking about these ways to cultivate stronger partnerships. So we're just going to do like a little sneak peek into this document. Like I said before, the purpose of this is that we really understand that all of our issues intersect with one another. And we wanted to bring attention to how sexual violence shows up in areas of a person's life, many different areas of a person's life, particularly through this series. So we kind of were selecting topics for this series based on that, based on our experience with survivors and how we see the impact of sexual violence sort of rippling out into a lot of different communities, parts of a survivor's life. And I think perhaps most importantly, as organizations or community leaders, whoever's here on this call, we don't exist somewhere outside of our communities. We are also a part of them. We are active players in our own communities, and building relationships between the people who are working and living inside of different sectors really strengthens our connection to each other and those in our orbit, which is that ripple effect, right? And we also wanted to highlight that stronger communities and positive relationships actually protect against violence and other negative health outcomes from occurring in the first place. So while we're mostly focused on strategies for intervention, there is this prevention component because we talk about, protective factors, and these are things in a person's life that actually protect them from experiencing sexual violence. And so throughout our web conference today, we'll be talking about faith communities specifically, and how anyone from faith tradition can address and respond to sexual violence, especially with the help of their local sexual assault program. And so we're going to take a quick look at what is inside this document. Really, these are just a couple of sections. We'll talk about, partnerships versus collaboration. We'll talk about specific goals of community partnerships. What are our desired outcomes? In the guide, we'll have some action steps for whole community involvement. And we also have some pieces about working together in an equitable manner and balancing things like equity and feedback and all of these other pieces that are really important in building sustainable partnerships. Really, what we tried to do is offer some practical tools and actual action steps for creating and building partnerships across many different sectors with the purpose of responding to violence. We've also, the last thing that I'll mention here is that we have in this blueprint included detailed information and step-by-step processes to help build lasting relationships between sexual assault programs or rape crisis centers and other sectors that they may interact with. Malak, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you. So this idea of, or this question of sexual violence and faith and the role of faith in sexual violence interventions, when Sarah and I began talking about this, I did share, to me, it's very obvious. Being in a space, being a feminist of a faith tradition, turning to my faith in times when I have felt most challenged as a feminist and actually been re-inspired from my own faith tradition to do the work that I do as an organizer, The connection between the two seems just completely personally obvious to me. And at the same time, on the other hand, I often work in spaces where that connection doesn't exist for people, or that connection between faith and faith leaders and faith organizers, and then those who are organizing on gender justice issues. Those, Sarah mentioned silos before. People have some sort of trepidation breaking those silos and have hesitancy and questions. And oftentimes it's very well-meaning hesitancy. It's like, what if I say the wrong thing? Like, what if I ask, it can be really simple things. Like I think in the participants, you'll see at least one other Kaur, and no, we're not related because Sikh women have a common last name, Kaur. That was ever since 1699. It's part of our faith tradition to have this common casteless name that you share as a sisterhood. So it's interesting that sometimes it's just well-meaning hesitations that prevent people from building connections and understanding with faith communities. And we're hoping that as we talk today, we'll really see that making generalized assumptions hurts our larger movement and quest to end sexual violence. And also that, sometimes asking those questions couched in, I don't know enough, but can you tell me more, can be really helpful, because there are a lot of community leaders within faith groups that are doing essential work to combat sexual violence, as there are, of course, amazing rape crisis counselors who have been doing work regardless of somebody's faith or no faith background. So I'm hoping, I'm really excited about the conversation to come, and want to hear also from the participants. We'll get to that shortly, about kind of what are the things that sometimes hold us back from making what seems to me and a lot of other people obvious connections and alliances. I think with that, Sarah, I'll turn it to the next. All right, so what have you heard people say about sexual violence in your community? So this can be in your faith community. This can be, you've heard from people off your own faith community or off another community. You've heard from people, who you work with, or people you just know. So it's however you think about it. It might be something that's been irritating you for the last day or so. It might be something that you heard years ago that still is there in your head. And you're like, yep, this is what people generally say about sexual violence in my community, however you define community. So we wanted to just throw that open to folks to share some prevalent things that you have heard and come across.
And then I think Shelby just dropped a link in the chat. We're actually going to invite you to follow that link, and we can all view the screen here together. And so in order to, if you want to reply anonymously, you can use these Post-its, and you can drag them into the center, and you can double click on it, and you can start typing. And then we'll be able to see your responses. Oh, there are lots of responses coming in. Malika, are there any of these that you want to lift up? Do you want to give folks a couple more minutes to finish their thought?
Yeah, I'm reading these, and the stars, people are dragging and putting stars on Post-its that resonate with them. That's right, Sarah?
Yeah, that's right. That's it.
No,
Seems
yeah,
like you figured it out without me saying it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think exactly what so many of you are resonating to each other's comments here. And I think so many of them resonate with me. You know, you made your bed, now lay in it. That whole idea just is again linked to they asked for it. I saw that earlier. Oh, you asked for it. Why was she at a party? So all these questions about the victim's behavior prior to being victimized by sexual assault, like all these questions seem, this falls in that whole bucket of turning the onus to the person who in fact has been victimized. All in God's will may have deserved it for past wrongdoings. It's karma. There is a lot about, you know, we could spend, theologians spend a lot of time talking about God's will or the Almighty's will versus free will and how those two interact and don't. And yeah, I can hear this in different faith communities said in different ways, whatever word people use for God. Yep, there's that whole idea of either get over it, it's all part of this larger plan, or you may have deserved it because of some larger extra, you know, larger plan that we can't even see. So again, a victim blaming response, or at least if not directly victim blaming, it's not affirming for a victim to hear this is just part of a larger plan. I see also we need to talk to our daughters. And I love that one because it could be positive, right? I talk to my daughter who is not yet 4 about her body and body autonomy. So it could be that. It could also be we need to talk to our daughters so they do not meet with people of the opposite sex and get into bad situations, because then of course there will be rape. So it depends how that one could be a very positive. Let's talk to our daughters so they talk about anyone entering their personal space without their consent. It could also be we need to police our daughters, which is a very different message, of course, but those resonated with me immediately when I read that. I thought, yep, okay, the parents should have done a better job. The person who's writing right now, the parents should have done a better job to control their daughters. Yep, so that's linked to that earlier point as well. She or they provoked the assault. I see that one there. So again, that there's something that the person, the victim, the survivor did that resulted in the assault, and focusing again on everything the victim did instead of the person who chose to use their power and assaulted. The full spectrum, anything from believe the victim to the person couldn't possibly have done that. So I love this one because I think when we gave you such a broad question of what you hear in your community, I think this is a really fair answer, right? There's a lot of diversity in whatever even you identify as your community. There usually are all sorts of people, even on the same case that might be a big issue or case in your community at a certain point. There can be all sorts of responses across the spectrum. So this answer makes a lot of sense as well. And I would never rape anyone. Yes, so this is an important one too. There's a lot of confusion when we put out statistics and we share, and we'll get into that soon. I think we hear this regularly too at the Sikh Family Center, where people are just completely shocked because they'll say things like, well, no, like no one in my family would ever, I have never experienced. So taking that individual experience as, of course, then it must apply to my entire community. And sometimes that comes from a place of trying to protect one's community, but it definitely doesn't help in protecting and serving victims and survivors. Yeah, I think, Sarah, was there any other that jumped out at you?
No, not particularly. I mean, this is all stuff that we hear all the time inside of faith communities and outside of them. So there's, I think, this interesting crossover between dominant culture narrative and maybe what's said behind closed doors in faith communities. And so I just, appreciate everyone's participation. All of it are things that we've heard from just being people in the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I really thank you all for sharing these. And I will say, one of the things that I did in thinking about today, and I talked about to Meghna and Sarah from Valor USA just feels like a month ago, but I think it was last week or something. Just as thinking back to people, since I've been doing this work since 2002, and by this work, I mean work directly serving victims and survivors of sexual assault. And what I did for today was also just reflect on cases and clients and people who I have worked with who belong to, identified themselves as belonging to a faith community, and were also survivors of sexual violence. And I wanted to share a few stories with you because I think, and now that I've seen your responses and I know who's in the audience, I think a lot of these will sound familiar to you all as well. So the first one, Sarah, I think, yeah, let's see what there. Okay, yeah, the packing the court story. This one I can just, it's so vivid in my mind because I witnessed all of this unfold, where a young woman who came to a gender justice organization, she was a victim of both domestic or intimate partner violence that included sexual violence of pretty horrific nature. And she did not speak fluent English. She did not have a permanent immigration status in this country. She worked at a small restaurant and was earning a pretty modest, or was being underpaid actually to a large extent. So it was like one vulnerability on top of the other. As far as the advocates and service providers were concerned, this is the kind of case where everyone was worried she's going to this really difficult court hearing where she's going to have to talk about her experiences. We all must go with her. She has no one. There's this kind of conversation, who else can go to court that day just to be there, to show solidarity. There's no one going to be with her, etc. And when we arrive, I just remember walking outside that courthouse where we had agreed to meet with her. And we see her just surrounded by people. She had like a dozen people around her, and she's looking like ready and resolute to do what she needs to, but these people around her looking even more ready and resolute to do what they need to, which is to be there for her. And, you know, slowly one started asking her, just as they introduced themselves, it turned out these were people from her congregation and her church, which she hadn't mentioned to the advocates because perhaps no one asked. People were so focused on asking about her vulnerabilities. People did not really think about her strengths and where she drew them from. She had coworkers who belonged to her church, but she also had people in the church congregation who were adamantly standing by her and wanted to show that support. So these assumptions about people's support systems, these are something, again, you know, I can harp on this all day long. Like we really need to see people as full people, and not who are going through something really difficult in their lives at that time, and not as these people that entirely have, you know, not make this assumption they have absolutely no one. And especially this assumption can come from a place of not asking some of the obvious questions, like, okay, you don't have immediate family here, like who else do you think you know, is a good person to talk to? Who else is trustworthy in your life? Who else? Like those would have perhaps opened up and alerted us to this idea that she was cocooned by a larger community and a faith community at that. The next one that I thought of was this, on the flip side, another Christian identifying woman. She actually grew up in her church and church community, and church was everything in terms of her social network. She met what seemed like a good Christian boy through that community. They got married, they had twins. The marriage was difficult. And from difficult, not all difficult marriages are abusive, but it became abusive. This marriage did. And they were in this very, and it included a lot, again, of sexual violence. And this is one of the other things that so many of you were responding to, how we think about sexual violence in our community. You mentioned that she shouldn't have dressed this way or gone there or whatever else. People still think of sexual violence, given what our media and culture is, as, you know, one-time encounter, and something happens when somebody's gone out and they're dressed in a way that's provocative. There's all these ideas, but there's a lot of sexual violence that takes place within homes by people who folks are, you know, married to or partnered with or trust the most or related to in other ways. So this was one of those cases where he used faith and tradition as kind of this, I'm the king of the castle, what I say goes. Of course, the husband can't rape his wife, and he had kind of try to program her to believe that was true till she finally did leave and knew that it absolutely was just a way for him to further his abuse. In her case, she tried to sidestep a really bad, acrimonious court process by entering into mediation with her husband. Again, her church people encouraged her. What does the legal system understand of our community? There's all these biases against people of faith. You know, we should enter this mediation. You both can talk about it, accept everything they both talked about. And there's some legal rules and regulations around what is said in mediation can't be said in court, etc. But what was being said in mediation, he would say to people at things like church picnics and other things, like he would just talk about it openly and freely. So she began to receive all of these questions and gossip really from her community till the point where she had to leave her church, right? The church that had meant everything to her. So she didn't just lose, you know, she lost really a large part of her identity because she felt really forced out and felt that people had taken sides, just given how they were so invested in thinking of her life as the source of almost entertainment and gossip. And that's also something survivors face very often. No one in our family has ever, I was thinking of like, this is not one case, I'm thinking of so many cases where people will say, oh, I'm reaching out for services, and they'll have some trepidation and worry about it because they'll say, well, in our family, no one's ever had to deal with something like this. And the minute I hear no one has ever, in any context, ever in my life, I always pause. I'm like, there must be exceptions, right? And then this one, you know, like I was saying, I can think of so many cases that fall under this umbrella and so many experiences, including like experiences of different types of my own, where people will say, well, in our family, and it's like, oh, no, we know, like, let's talk a little bit more. But I was thinking particularly of a Muslim woman, a young girl who said, there are a lot of people supporting me. You know, they understand the sexual assault wasn't my fault, but they're also saying, just let it go. Don't make noise. Brings attention to our family, and our family, like no one's ever dealt with something like this, right? And that was one of those cases where, since she mentioned so many supportive women in our family, I did ask her, like, hey, do you think it makes sense to talk to your aunties a little bit more about what they mean by nobody in our family has ever? And the next time I saw this woman, she actually said, one of my aunts finally lashed out against the family as we're having a conversation. And she said, has everyone forgotten that I was forced to have an abortion because I was sexually assaulted by somebody, and the family didn't want to deal with it, but they did also not want me to have this child out of wedlock? So oftentimes these kind of umbrella statements that are told to survivors to make them shut up are statements that in fact underneath them carry so much else and so many things that may have been hidden even over the generations right around us. The next one on here was We're All Survivors. This is very relevant to my community and the Sikh community. When the community Ori has, finds its history in the U.S. in a very it's complicated. The roots in the U.S. are from flights from colonialism starting in the 1900s, then economic hardship, immigration exclusion, then state-based violence from India in the 1980s and 90s resulted in asylees coming to this country. So oftentimes there's a sentiment, everyone is a survivor. So why do these women, and especially these younger women, suddenly want to bring attention and shame to a vulnerable community? Like, deal with it, like, get over it. We've all gotten over things. So this kind of an attitude, again, I'm seeing a lot of women, a lot of younger women who are saying, me too, this happened to me too. I want to talk about it. It's happened to my family too. When they're hit with this, but we're all survivors, be strong, move along, it can be deeply problematic. And the last one in here is they don't want to talk about it. And just a really quick thing on this would be, I was reminded 15 years ago, the county I was working in did an interfaith event similar to what, the kind of faith and sexual violence and gender-based violence. And they kept rumoring that no one is coming, no one's signing on to this event. We're advertising everywhere and there's all these posters and except the way they were advertising was to large, mostly churches that they could see visibly as spaces of faith, and they're flyering there. Their poster also, the flyer that they were using, had faith symbols, as problematic or incomplete as that can be, that did not include many faith communities beyond the 2 or 3 symbols that they had found and put up there. And the third thing they did, it certainly didn't include, for example, Sikh symbol. I noticed that, I know, and I remember. The third thing was they highly advertised it as an event for people in the clergy. And again, that deeply limits who's going to attend, right? Because there are faith traditions, like many of those represented even here today, that do not have a clerical group, do not have a clergy, right? Don't have that kind of a model. So who are you calling in, right? If you can expand even our language matters on who comes in and who talks. You'll see yeah, this is a quilt, a photo I took back in 2012 in a church. It was a quilt that I think represents, I just carry this message with me because it resonated so greatly. The ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. This is one of those things that I believe anyone who truly works in their faith community, anybody who really cares about community gets. This is why there's so much focus on how we raise our children. Communities, religious and faith communities spend so much time on, those kinds of family values being given to very young children, because this understanding of what's happening in our home, what's actually happening instead of what's just said and what's just preached is really important. And I think for anyone who really gets that, we have to begin combating violence that often turns away folks from how, on the one hand, we're preached all of this stuff about, spiritual enlightenment. On the other hand, even our physical safety is something that's not considered due to us and is not protected as a human right. So I just wanted to share this, which was a beautiful quilt. And I remember having a wonderful conversation with this congregation about gender violence and how we all have different reasons for why we do this work. Some are inspired by maybe otherworldly things, but a lot of us are also inspired by the stories of survivors in our own homes and our own communities who are creating stronger communities by speaking up and standing up.
So we wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about sexual violence, providing an overview, what is sexual violence, and just so we have kind of a shared understanding and shared definition. When we use the term sexual violence, we're using it as an umbrella term that encompasses all forms of any unwanted sexualized interaction. And we place such an emphasis on the any part of it, because when folks start talking about sexual violence, they can really get hyper fixated on rape and sexual assault and really, we're talking about sexual harassment. We're talking about sexual violence that's happening inside of marriage or relationships, all of these things. And the way that somebody is going to respond to this, to an experience of sexual violence, whether it be sexual harassment at work or sexual assault inside of a relationship or a stranger rape or any of the dozens of other ways that folks can experience violence, it's really going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, the way that somebody kind of processes through that trauma, the way that somebody internalizes it. So we want to make sure that we, are really clear about the fact that we're talking about a really a broad spectrum or expansive way at looking at these different behaviors and experiences of sexualized violence. Whenever we do, sexual violence 101 trainings, there's always like a ton of statistics, right? And I'm sure that we've heard a lot of them. But, in my experience, statistics and numbers are really not the things that like stick to people when we're talking about violence and talking about the impact of violence. Sure, they, numbers and statistics can be very useful when we're applying for a grant or writing a paper. But aside from that, it doesn't really capture what it is that we really want folks to know about the way that sexual violence works. And I think for me, really one of the most important things to understand is that sexual violence is power-based violence. We have seen this all throughout history. Sexual violence has been used as a tool of power and control, a tool of war for since the beginning of time. Many folks may not know this, but people with certain identities are a lot more likely to experience sexual violence than others. Of course, women or people identifying as women, LGBTQ folks, people of color are all a lot more likely to experience sexual violence. And that's because of this power that is asserted by the dominant culture. Just to kind of share a fact about that, for example, Indigenous American women are at the greatest risk of experiencing sexual violence, and they also experience the highest number of stranger rapes out of any other group. And we can see here that this example, I mean, this is directly tied to American settler colonialism, because like I said before, rape has always been used as a tool of power and control, a tool of colonialism and war and genocide. It is very, very much power-based violence. It is very much a way to assert power and control over somebody else, or sometimes even an entire group of people. And this is really part of why it's so devastating and so traumatic, right? Because it's this really effective way of stripping power and control from an individual, which can result in a completely decimated sense of safety, a completely decimated sense of self. Especially if the person who is assaulted assaulted or experiences sexual violence from somebody that they know. And that's super common. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this can really, really erode trust and boundaries. And it can also result in distorted reality, distorted thinking, difficulty in having difficulty in maintaining healthy relationships in the future. It can lead to trouble at work and trouble with people's spiritual identities, right? All of these different aspects of a person's life are impacted by having this power and control stripped away from them, particularly by somebody that they know. And we'll talk about how this interacts with the brain in just a little bit, in a little bit more depth, but something that I'll say here is that, the brain can perceive even a one-time instance of sexual violence as an ongoing threat. And after experiencing a traumatic event, especially one like sexual violence, the survival part of our brain, which is also known as the reptile brain, can kick into overdrive and kind of get stuck there even years after the assault, especially for children and young folks, and folks who have had repeated exposure to violence and sexual violence. But this can even be true for what we call acute incidences, which means a one-time incident of sexual violence. And like I said, we'll talk about this in a couple minutes, but this, in short, can lead to just really massive life problems. And the trauma brain stuff really gets even worse if the abuse is consistent, as I mentioned before, because the alarm system will just keep sounding in your brain and it'll kind of get stuck there. And folks really need intensive therapy and things like that to kind of pull themselves out of it and become more regulated so that they can do the things in life that we need to be regulated to do, like making important decisions or doing our jobs or being in relationship with others, so many things. And I think the other thing that's important to know, and this is kind of the last point here, is that identity, who we are, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our racial or ethnic identity, our faith or religious identity, all of these things really impacts the way that we will respond to sexual violence, as does past experiences of violence, our psychological state, things like use. All of these different factors or parts of a person's life that are working together that really inform how somebody is going to respond and how they're going to internalize the violence and what kind of support they're going to need. And so we say all of that just to really underscore the point that a one size fits all model is just not effective. Well, of course, there is some commonalities, and we'll talk about those. It's important to know that everybody's needs are just a little bit different depending on all of these different factors. But one thing that we see, one of these commonalities across the board, is that we often see that people's faith communities play a really big role in their healing journey. And this can sometimes be for better or for worse, right? That response is everything. Like Malika's packing the court story, right, is a wonderful story. And then we see others that you know, a healing journey can really be impacted in a negative way if the faith community is not supportive, or a lot of those victim blaming things that we saw when we did the interactive Google slide activity. So we say all of this to say that the response of the faith community is really crucial, since healing is often about rebuilding trust and creating a sense of safety after that has been completely stripped away from somebody. So if somebody discloses sexual assault and then they're shunned by a faith leader or a community member that they really trust, it often reinforces this belief that the world is unsafe and that people are untrustworthy, etc. So we will look at a couple statistics because some people like statistics. I'm one of them. We'll do this very quickly. Just for some quick numbers, 40% of rapes and sexual assaults were reported to police in 2017, but we actually have seen that number drop in 2018, which is interesting that we're starting to see reports go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, it absolutely doesn't mean that sexual violence has necessarily gone down, but people are making less and less police reports over the last couple of years. And about half of women identified victims of rape reported being raped by an intimate partner and 40% by an acquaintance. So anywhere between like 85 to 90% of sexual assaults are committed by somebody who the victim survivor knows personally, often an acquaintance or an intimate partner. And the last thing that I think is really important to know is that the prevalence of false reporting for sexual assault crimes is incredibly low. There's been a couple of different studies on this, but the numbers that are often cited are, you know, anywhere between 2 and 10%. And so, you know, we hear a lot of rhetoric around you know, this person is just making it up for attention, or they're just doing it because they want to get back at someone. But really, I mean, we can kind of rest assured that the research is there and it shows us that that is actually extremely uncommon. And then before I hand it back over to Malika, I'm just going to talk quickly about these first couple of points regarding considerations about faith in sexual violence, which is what we're here to talk about. 80% of people in the United States have some religious or faith affiliation. That's a huge number, and there's a broad spectrum of this, and we'll kind of talk about the different ways that faith can, you know, show up in people's lives a little bit. But just, we like to say that, you know, it's a really, really big amount of people, and oftentimes people who are in crisis, who have maybe been inactive in their faith communities, will sometimes, you know, still seek that kind of support or reach out to their faith in times of crisis. The role of faith leaders can really influence intervening in and preventing sexual violence in communities. The roles of faith leaders can be really important in not only helping people cope or processing things like anger at God or anything else that might come up, but also members of a congregation can look to faith leaders to kind of influence how they're going to respond to sexual violence or domestic violence, if that's something that everybody knows about, like in some of the examples that we heard earlier. there's a study that I like to cite. There's a lot of studies like this, but just for an example, the Pew Religious Landscape Survey in 2014 that surveyed 1,000 pastors found that 3 out of 4 know someone who's experienced domestic or sexual violence, but only about half of them are familiar with local resources. So it's kind of what we're doing here today, and why we'd like to talk about some of the local resources that exist that can be a resource for faith communities. And we're also going to talk a little bit about ethno religions, kind of introducing that term. But, you know, at times entire ethnic groups are unified by their faith traditions. So some examples we see are Judaism and Sikhism and Hinduism. And religion as a category might not apply to these groups that see faith traditions as more of a way of life. And we'll kind of expand on that a little bit. I'll provide an example just for my own culture and community. So there are a lot of us who kind of identify as secular Jews, often meaning that we really identify with like the cultural heritage, but not the religious aspects of our faith tradition. We see, you know, in Judaism and in my community, there's a lot of these kind of cultural traditions and food and holidays and all of these things that are really like baked into our family and the way that we celebrate and the way that we respond to harm and the way that we communicate. But it's not really centered around a strong religious belief. It's not really about God or prayer. And sometimes I think with faith, providers can get really hyper fixated on these religious practices, you know, like, oh, would you like to pray? Would you like to talk to God? All of these options that we're sort of trained to answer or to ask rather. But there's a lot of other cultural traditions that can be equally, if not more important, that might be important to be aware of as, you know, you're supporting folks, particularly as part of kind of our cultural competence practice. And Malachi, I think you had a few things to add here as well, so I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, no, I think you covered most of it beautifully. That I was going to say, it was, you know, but just this idea, this religion, which as a category that presupposes there's a distinction between the religious and the secular, the private and the public, the sacred and the, you know, profane. These kind of distinctions are not carried in a lot of non-Western, non-Christian religious traditions. And, you know, and it doesn't mean that these traditions are just specific to one certain ethnicity. It's actually this larger thing of certain faith traditions really have this idea of the entire body politic carries the faith, and there can be a lot of diversity within that. So I think we just, even in our language and using words like faith and using words like tradition, it opens it up for survivors to think about which part of their faith identity they may rely on, and just makes and signals that it's okay for people to be relying on things that come from their faith tradition, and that doesn't assume that they are in some way you know, just bound entirely by some sort of certain dogma or certain ideas from the tradition. So like kind of opening it up is really important in how we talk to survivors about faith, and not thinking that if they're a person of faith, they are definitely going to, you know, again, pray a certain number of times of the day, or that they're going to definitely take certain days of the week off. Like those big things that we might have studied in our high school world religions class, which may, you know, if you had one, those things might not apply to the individual survivors. So again, the one size fits one is so important with our interactions with folks. And I can tell you in the Sikh community, for example, there isn't a focus on orthodoxy as much as there's a focus on or orthopraxy, where praxis is really more important than belief even. And there's like all of these beautiful ways in which our scripture talks about, like, you know, belief, you can say, I believe something. And then if you're not practicing it, you're not actually living up to your faith. So from that sort of a background, I find it very natural if I have a survivor who says, I'm a deeply spiritual person, and they cannot quote a single thing from their scripture, right? Those two things can happen together. They might not be able to quote anything, but they're a deeply spiritual person. They were raised around certain teachings, certain ways of doing things, certain ways. and ceremonies at birth, at marriage, at death, at any critical stage of life, they turn to their faith tradition on how they do things. And so if it's a critical stage of life, like overcoming a trauma, they might lean on their faith traditions in many different ways. And it might not include asking for a priest to come and listen to them, or asking for an imam, right? There might not be equivalents of priests and imams for them. So just asking, what is it, that I, if you're in that position as a provider, asking, what is it that I can do to facilitate this really important source for your healing? And if you're somebody who's in the faith community, again, we would urge, meet survivors where they're at, right? This is not an opportunity to tell people, well, if only you prayed more, or if only you understood scripture better. It's more an opportunity to say, I'm so glad you identify with our faith, because there are sources of real strength and support within here. Yeah, I wanted to share this from the Sikh Family Center's last survey of 500 Sikhs across the country. We've done surveys in different forms. This was an online survey, but our responses have been consistent, whether we're doing in person or online. We often get people anonymously when they're answering surveys about sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence, report exactly what we know to be true in the larger community, which is that most sexual violence is not stranger rape, is in fact, for most communities, what they're seeing is, and what's pushed off into the shadows, is acquaintance rape, or even rape by family members, whether it's family by birth or family by marriage. And so I just think in the context of faith communities, it's really important to remember, no matter how small and protected and spiritual or religious or orthodox you might think of your own faith community, right? The power, one person using their power and abuse over another is still happening. It's happening to those in their immediate orbits. And those survivors and victims feel very silenced when all we do about sexual violence is say, girls should be more careful, don't walk when it's late at night without a friend, don't go to this party, right? So those survivors who never went to a party, didn't get, jumped by somebody outside, etc., those people are the large majority of very invisibilized folks in a lot of our communities. So paying heed and attention to all survivors, whether or not they were assaulted by someone they knew or not, is something we really push for in the work that we do. So what can faith leaders do? I mentioned a few of these things earlier. So whether or not you see yourself as a faith leader, I think that word is also problematic, right? Because there's a lot of claims of on leadership, often by often by straight men in all communities. So, but I would urge you to think of, if you're playing a leadership role in your faith community, what can you do? So become familiar with abuse and power dynamics. And it's so if some of the stuff that's being mentioned today, or the way we're talking about sexual assault, sounds really inside speak, reach out for more resources and try to learn and read more about why we keep saying this is rooted in power. I think that comes naturally, that understanding comes naturally as we look back in history, as Sarah mentioned, but in case it's something that you're not familiar with, getting more familiar is important, and it's always a learning process, right? So think of the younger generation, like we work with teenagers today who interact in ways that we never interacted in as teenagers, right? So if they're dealing with power and control over tech, there's a learning curve there for a lot of us. We need to understand what is it? How is technology playing a role in how they are being, both bullied, or survivors are being doubly traumatized by their abusers, etc. So there's always learning to do here. Collaborating with sexual assault professionals to establish a support plan. We'll talk about how to find sexual assault professionals. Sarah's going to introduce you to that in a couple of minutes, but establishing a support plan is key to be done before a crisis, before somebody comes and discloses a sexual assault to you, because we know it's happening in our communities. It's all around us. And if you're a trusted person in your faith community, you are bound to have someone come and disclose, either explicitly or hint towards a situation of sexual coercion, sexual assault. And it's really important to have a plan of what you, your community, the organization you represent, what you're going to do in response, ideally in conjunction with experts who work with victims every day. Actively cultivate things we know to prevent violence. These, include things like increasing girls' leadership and voice in our communities and congregations so that when they speak, they are truly heard and it's not just seen as noise, right? That's really important to do on a consistent basis, and so that they become more confident in the fact that when they speak, somebody is going to listen and somebody is going to respond. This can also include things about talking about healthy gender relationship, healthy gender dynamics, talking about healthy relationships early on. If you're in a community that doesn't believe in premarital sex as a result of faith, okay, think about how to still talk about your faith value while perhaps talking about healthy dating and relationships, right? And not just pushing this idea or these conversations away just because they don't suit our immediate comfort zone. It's really important for us to meet our young people where they're at so they can begin talking about these things and they can begin sharing what for too long they've been told are taboo topics in their community. Pushing back against social norms like gender stereotypes. I wish I had a profound example here, but the one that keeps coming to my mind is don't throw like a girl. This starts really early, that our biological sex gets associated with our gender. And that's a super problem. We could do a whole session on that, all of us together, and talk about all the examples in our life where the reproductive organ we were born with seems to control, define and predetermine our entire personality, choices, etc. But this does truly start really early, right? As saying girls equal to weakness, vulnerability, overfeeling, oversensitivity, and then creating a binary girls versus like the strength and the of the boys. If we can avoid that, it would be already a step towards better gender dynamics. So we're going to, Sarah, do we have time for the video?
What do you think? We can always send it out after if we prefer to do that.
Perhaps. And yes, and I also did receive an important message in addition. I should have definitely said, the sexual violence and rape, of course, happens to boys and men too, right? I think I definitely don't want to forward that problematic narrative. We have a protected girls, rape victim equal to girl. That's absolutely not true. So I was remiss in kind of signaling it that way. And in what the examples I've given so far, we absolutely see it happening to people of all genders. And definitely what Sarah mentioned about LGBTQ community, about, we look at transgender folks. I think it's like the numbers are they're horrific, like 48%, 53% of transgender people have been victims of sexual violence in their lives, but also folks who identify as and are straight men and straight boys, right? So it's not, again, it's something that can affect people when anyone who is in a powerful position is able to exert that power in an abusive way. I think we should send out, the video link is sent out. It is a good video. I agree, Katie. I love this video too. But what we were hoping to really pull, so do watch it. It's 9 minutes, almost less than 9 minutes worth your time. But what we wanted to pull from this is on the next slide, Sarah, when we talk about do no harm and respecting survivors' autonomy. It sounds so simple, right? That at least we do no more harm to somebody who's already been harmed. But one thing that's really important to realize is that even in our seemingly well-meaning questions to survivors, we can often be signaling, I don't believe you, or, how is it, it's not normal, the reaction you're having, or how is it possible if your story is true, you don't even remember what color his shirt was or her shirt was, right? So this video really helps us think and see, and through some great examples of what happens to our brain under extreme fear response. It goes into this FFF alarm, fight, flee, freeze. And the defense, that's a defense mechanism of the brain. The brain is working exactly as it's meant to. It's working to survive. And when it's working to survive, biologically, there's like neuroscientists prove this, the brain cannot remember all sorts of other extraneous details. It's just trying to get through and survive. Our body seizes that kind of energy, saves it and stores it as a memory. And that's why we often see these physiological, long-lasting responses to trauma, because unless there have been interventions and assistance in the body releasing that kind of energy from the trauma, the body has a lot of, again, which seem like unnatural or unexplainable reactions. So I think I'm summarizing it very, very quickly here, but to truly stand by and respect survivors, we have to begin understanding they've gone through something in which their body skipped its evolved human brain circuits and went back to its very basic tendency to just be able to continue breathing, continue surviving, get out of the situation, however best and fast as possible. We did want to talk about, what else can faith leaders do? Privacy, discretion, and being very careful if you have mandated reporting requirements. Of course, this conversation is a little more complicated, but what I always like saying is be very transparent in what you are promising, right? Don't say this conversation is confidential when it's not. Maybe it's private. Maybe you will not volunteer information to their friend or to your friend, but you might legally be bound to disclose information. So make that clear. And if you're legally bound to disclose information, there are some other places that are not, right? So here, call this rape crisis hotline. Don't even have to give your name. Let's go that way. Maybe that's the right way for you to go. So just giving people options and making sure we're saying, I will protect your information to the best of my ability, but also being transparent if you have legal requirements to disclose. Using expertise as spiritual leaders to highlight positive values of faith and tradition. We all of the faith traditions that I'm familiar with at least have some values that are affirming positive anti-oppression, pro-justice. Why not talk about those? Why not lift up those instead of getting maybe, pulled into the weeds of minutiae around a text written many hundreds of years ago or a certain quote that's been taken out of context many times and saying, well, this one might suggest, right? As faith leaders, we can use our leadership, our spiritual leaders, whether it's in your tiny little book club or it's in, whatever group you are a leader in, perhaps lift those values more. And clarify your personal stance against violence and against faith being used as an excuse for violence. So this can be, again, it might be complicated. Your faith tradition, some scripture written a long time ago, some set of rules, some history might be, something that's even difficult for you and it feels problematic and it's hard to, you're like, I can't square this circle. Don't, just state from my collective, faith is love. Faith is not entirely rational. So out of my love, this is what I believe. And personally, I will always stand by victims. That can be a strong statement in itself. You don't have to be the final word on everything in your faith in order to be a good ally and support person.
And I just wanted to share a quote. We'll send out the slides and there's resources. There's a resource section where this article is linked, but I would give it a read. It's really just a nice example of the intersections of sexual violence and faith traditions and kind of everything that we're talking about here. So I will just quickly read this. The quote says, "But shunning and shaming is exactly what many women continue to endure in synagogue, in the workplace, and in day-to-day social interactions when their lives are not anchored in marriage or motherhood. At the same time, the lack of structural support for Jewish families, including affordable childcare and equitable parental leave policies, contradicts the Jewish community's supposed dedication to family." So I just really love this. I think it really sums up a lot of what we've been talking about, especially kind of around some of the social norms pieces and the way that we can step up in our faith communities and kind of build in some of that more structural support. So I would definitely recommend checking out that article for some really great examples.
Yeah, so we would love for you to share some needs that you have identified in the past or are thinking of right now in your faith community when it comes to sexual violence or responding to or, and or preventing sexual violence. So what are some needs that you identify in your own communities? And since I parent, like I said, almost 4-year-old, I'm often talking about needs versus wants. But here I think, you can include needs and wants, things that you think, this would be my dream if my community had X related to sexual violence, responding to sexual violence, standing with survivors, etc.
And I think while folks are taking a minute to get their answers and thoughts together and write in the chat, I will kind of introduce our next section briefly, and then we'll come back if that's okay. And then we'll look at what folks said before we kind of move into our conversation about sexual assault programs. So yeah, please take a minute and put your responses in the chat, and then we will look at those in maybe 30 to 60 seconds. But just wanted to quickly introduce the next section here. We are going to spend the rest of our time today talking about the sexual assault programs of California, also known as rape crisis centers. I know that several of you here today are from rape crisis centers. I think we also have a number of folks from faith communities, maybe not familiar with rape crisis centers. So we just wanted to take some time and share information about what a rape crisis center is, the resources that are available to you as a person in a faith community, the services that are provided, and how we can, really build bridges to come together to harness that collective power we were talking about of supporting survivors of sexual violence in our communities. So I don't see any comments in the chat. So maybe I'll keep moving through, and then when we start to see some pop in, we can, I'll pause and we can go back to that. And we just wanted to know, we're going to do a quick poll here to see if folks are aware of their local rape crisis center. This is just like a really quick yes or no. So do you know who your local rape crisis center is? There's one in every county in California, which we'll talk about. So everybody definitely has one. So we'd like to know if you're aware of them. It looks like the votes are coming in. So far, everyone has answered yes, that they are aware of their local rape crisis center, which is super, super great. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, and then we'll just have one more. And we'd like to know, have you ever connected with your local rape crisis center? Do you have a relationship? Have you referred people in your community to the local rape crisis center? Let's see, we still have mostly yes, but we're seeing a couple no's in here as well. I will give folks a couple minutes, or a couple seconds rather, to respond, and then I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. It looks like most folks have connected though, so that's great. And then it looks like we have a couple comments in the chat. Let's see. Lisa says, as a Christian working in an interfaith org, it was very helpful to hear more about the nuances of religious and spiritual identity and ethnic identity. I would certainly benefit from further conversation with my colleagues on that matter. Thank you so much for that comment. And then just so we can spend some time talking about the rape crisis centers and get folks out of here on time, we would like you to, well, maybe change this here to a chat question. So if there are any top concerns that you have about sending someone from your congregation or community to your local RCC, your local rape crisis center or sexual assault program, please let us know what those are. And so we can see if we're addressing them in our next couple of slides here. So yeah, if you could put in the chat, what are your top concerns about sending someone from your congregation or community to your local RCC? So while folks are getting their thoughts together, I will talk about the rape crisis centers in California. So rape crisis centers, we also call them RCCs for short, are nonprofit community-based organizations that provide a huge variety of services to sexual assault survivors and the community. And this often includes case management, connecting folks to local resources, accompaniment to law enforcement interviews or court or forensic exams, also known as rape kits, if folks have an assault that they're choosing to report. In the case of assault or violence that is with or committed by somebody that the person knows, a lot of advocates can assist in people getting orders of protection, also called restraining orders. Rape crisis centers
All right, I think Sarah's frozen. I'm sure she's frantically trying to get back. All right, so I think etc. for rape crisis centers that she mentioned, that is the next part of that was like thinking about prevention and work that they do in terms of prevention, outreach to the community, and how essential that can be, outreach in schools, on campuses, etc. And I think as you see, the PowerPoint has helpfully disappeared. We love technology, but I remember the next point because it's so important. They're highly flexible. So rape crisis centers, for those who are not from representing rape crisis centers, I think it's really essential to know that often communities may have biases. Thank you for that. Communities may have even ideas or biased ideas about what a rape crisis center does. And it's really important to know that the one-on-one training we get as rape crisis counselors is meet the person where they're at, right? It's not telling them, oh, you must do this. Oh, you must pursue now. If there's a criminal case, let's also pursue some sort of tort action. Like, it's not pushing them. It's giving people a menu of options and really seeing from that menu what makes sense to the individual survivor. And I think this is really an important message to carry into our faith communities, that this isn't this isn't some sort of prescription that they have the top 3 things are a rape survivor must do XYZ. Sometimes, just like to you as community leaders, people come to a rape crisis center saying, I just want to move on with my life. I want to make sure my body is safe and healthy. I want to make sure I haven't, have no disease as a result of this act. And then I don't want to ever talk about it. And the rape crisis counselor will listen and say, okay, let's meet your priorities, right? And I think that all of just telling people and making folks realize that the rape crisis services that our survivors might access are not pushing an agenda can be really important. Okay, I think, I don't know, Meghna, if you want to answer this one, the question about rape crisis centers only assisting survivors of rape or even other types of sexualized violence, my answer is always it's different types of sexualized violence, and it's defined pretty broadly. In fact, it can be defined more narrowly in our communities of rape equal to forced penetration. And I've never had that experience at a rape crisis center approaches it in that narrow way, but maybe Meghna can add some expert input there.
Thank you, Malika. Hello, everyone. My name is Meghna and I work for Valor. I agree with you. I think you framed it really well. It's about, it's addressing more than rape, right? Sexual violence is on this continuum, as you mentioned, you and Sarah explained that. And I think Rape Crisis Centers addresses all the forms of like sexual violence. And as we know, sexual violence and domestic violence is also, connected in so many ways, right? It's unique, but it also is, their contextual risk and protective factors coincide with each other. They are very similar in many circumstances. So to answer your question, yes, RCCs do assist survivors of all forms of sexual violence. There are many dual agencies that address sexual and domestic violence and other like forms of trafficking as well. So I hope this answers your question, Dr. Petraquin. Hopefully I've pronounced your name correctly, but thank you for asking.
Yeah, and then the other question I think is really valid for people as well who are listening, which is how well prepared are rape crisis centers to deal interactively, to interact sensitively with people from a wide range of faith traditions. And I would say, as someone who's not representing, any sort of all the rape crisis centers or any particular one, I would say it varies. I think the whole meeting a survivor where they're at is what the training is. But there can be individual variations of how well an advocate, how comfortable they feel meeting someone who is talking about their faith being their, guiding identity of their community. So what I find happening is in those kinds of situations, if an advocate is not themselves immediately ready or prepared, they often will seek further assistance. They might even look for community-specific groups. They might even partner up with someone who is a little more aware. So that's what happens that's what I think happens in a lot of the cases that we see. We don't, as a person of a community that most people worry, is it Sikh? Is it Sikh? What is this? Who are you? Are you a sect of Islam? No, we're not. Coming from a very small, in that sense, community, I can tell you, we've never served someone who went to a rape crisis center and dealt with like some sort of hostility or lack of sensitivity, but there's often lack of awareness just because there is a lack of awareness about various faith traditions. And so that's where rape crisis centers might reach out and partner with some other group or seek assistance where they don't have full information. And that's what I would say my experience. That's where my experience has been. Welcome back, Sarah.
Thanks for covering everyone due to during that unscheduled maintenance. I think we're about ready to wrap up. Meghna, if you could just pop over. Yeah, so just here, like we mentioned before, you can go to our website, click get help, and you can find your local rape crisis center that way if you haven't reached out already. And then let's go to next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. So I think just Malika, if you want to do like a 30-second next steps, and then that'll be it.
Yeah, sure. So I think these we've mentioned these in various forms already today, but it might have already struck you. Do I know my local rape crisis center, right? Have I reached out? Do I know who to reach out to? And maybe I even reach out to them now, right? Because before a crisis is a good time to make a plan. Think of other gender justice organizations, networks in your faith community that might not be local, they might be national, they might be statewide or national, getting in touch with them in time. I think that's in time, which is now is the time, right? When you actually can be thinking outside of crisis mode, preparing yourself for when somebody does come to you in crisis and getting active, looking for opportunities in your community. There might be a movie night. There might be, there might be a reading group. It might be something. Doesn't have to be sexual assault 101. Please come attend this presentation. We're looking for opportunities, whatever makes sense in your community, to talk about sexual assault, to talk about family violence.
And then, like I said, we'll go ahead and send out these slides, but here's some resources, videos, articles for further reading. We really recommend you check them out. There's a lot of great stuff here. And then that will pretty much wrap us up. We can hang for a sec. If anyone has burning questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I also dropped the survey link in there, so please do fill that out. That evaluation and feedback is just really, really helpful and important to us. So we know what worked well and what maybe we could do differently next time. So we really appreciate your time on that. It's super short, like 2 or 3 minutes. And it means a lot to us. Meghna or Shelby, is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here with us on this Thursday. And people are thanking you, Sarah and Malika in the chat.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And huge thanks to Malika. I'll second that for co-presenting with us today. I think we can go ahead and probably stop the recording.